On this Wednesday night, making inroads against Russian forces. Ukraine reclaims some villages and residents return. Plus, the Canadian caring for the wounded in the war zone.
Some of them were just crying and asking, why am I alive?
Rising worries about rising waters. The Canadian communities flooded and the potential solutions to preserve and protect them. Breaking barriers to birth control, pushing for universal access to contraception in Canada. And hitting all the right notes. The Ukrainian band crescendoing to a Eurovision victory.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Exact figures about troops killed in battle have rarely been released by Ukrainian officials. Tonight, that country's National Guard gave a grim update. More than 560 of its soldiers, it says, have been killed since the Russian invasion began. The battles have been relentless. Ukrainian forces have regained some ground after a counter-offensive north of Kharkiv, pushing Russian forces closer towards the border. And fierce battles are underway across the Donbass region. Russia holds huge swaths of Ukrainian territory along the Black Sea. And a Kremlin-appointed leader is reportedly pushing for Moscow to declare one of those areas part of Russia. Redmond Shannon begins our coverage tonight.
My beloved land, this woman cries, returning home for the first time since the Russian invasion. Ukrainian troops say they recaptured villages in Kharkiv region in recent days. We never expected such aggression from our neighbours, she says in Russian. Where am I going to live now? This small apparent win for Ukraine stacked up against stalemates and losses across the east and south. In Russian-occupied Kherson, a report that the Kremlin-appointed leadership there now wants the area to formally join Russia. Similar moves have previously played out in the two self-declared republics in the Donbass. And fighting continues around Snake Island in the Black Sea, scene of the now famous standoff at the start of the invasion. Meanwhile, the bombardment continues at the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. Photos released by Ukraine's Azov battalion claim to show some of the injured soldiers holed up inside. While at the Vatican, the wives of two of those men plead with Pope Francis for help. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Sweden and Finland Wednesday in advance of their expected decisions to join NATO, a pledge from the UK to provide military support should either Nordic nation face an invasion.
In times of crisis, cooperation becomes even more important, and this applies not least for our international defence partnerships.
This cooperation, it increases enormously Finnish security.
Elsewhere in Europe, Russian natural gas flow fell by a quarter Wednesday. Ukrainian officials say they've turned off one of the main transit pipelines going through Ukrainian territory because they claim occupying Russian forces were trying to steal the gas. Donna?
All right, Redmond Shannon in London, thank you. As the war rages on, a Canadian doctor has gone to Ukraine to help. Elena Bulaktina was born in Russia but left over a decade ago to work as a forensic pathologist in Hamilton, Ontario. She has volunteered to treat Ukraine's wounded and says nothing prepared her for what she's seen.
I haven't seen so much human tragedy before, and these are like absolutely unnecessary sufferings. I understand this war, and everybody says, well, you know, there will be casualties, but when, like, you know, Russian sniper just kills a mother who are going to cross the bridge, like to Irpin, well, there's no justification to that.
She says the small hospital where she's volunteering is mainly working to stabilize the injured, who are then transferred to bigger hospitals in western Ukraine. One of the cities taking in the wounded and those displaced by the war is Dnipro, west of the Donbass. It's considered a safe haven right now, though it too has been targeted by Russian missiles. Our Crystal Goomansingh is there talking to the wounded and those who are helping them.
Такі уламки. Це от він мені застряг. Такий метал.
Safe and stitched up, Oleg holds the wad of metal that nearly ended his life.
В автівці їхав.
My soldier and I were in the car. The SUV came under fire and exploded behind the car. The glass flew out and wreckage flew into the cabin.
The metal embedded in his skin was so hot it burnt the hands of the soldier, putting pressure on the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. For security reasons, Global News is not revealing the full names of the wounded soldiers here, nor any identifying details about this facility. 52-year-old Yevhen was also hit with shrapnel that tore through his vehicle.
A fragment hit me in the thigh, pierced to the bone, but it's not a problem. We will get through it.
The men openly detailed their injuries, the stages of care from point of injury through to reaching a hospital, but both remain concerned for their comrades in combat. Oleg, a father of two, gets emotional when I ask about his recovery. After a moment, he explains that he feels helpless in the hospital bed.
I am sorry, I did not expect such a reaction from myself, because the guys from my unit, younger men and not as experienced as me. My thoughts are always with them.
It's a common sentiment, says this field medic crew. The soldiers they're assigned to treat and transport to hospital are often unwilling to accept the gravity of their injuries.
There's many shrapnel injured, many shotgun wounds, but many concussion.
A few weeks after the full invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Oleg Belotsky left his motorcycle racing career to drive an ambulance. Global News was invited to a staging area where these volunteers were gearing up for another rotation near the front lines.
I'm not feeling like Superman. Every time I'm scared, every time have pants. Every rotation.
It's an honest answer about a terrifying war that heavily relies on donations, including these ambulances. Back at the hospital, the chief sergeant says he found solace in a visit from some of his company.
They are alive and healthy, and that is important to me.
Both men say as soon as they can, they'll put their uniforms back on and return to the fight. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, Dnipro, Ukraine.
People in parts of southern and central Manitoba are bracing for more rain that could make the flooding worse. And more people than ever have been displaced by flooding in communities in the Northwest Territories. As climate scientists have warned, flooding that used to be rare is now more frequent and extreme. The question is not if it's going to continue, but how are we going to adapt? Eric Sorensen reports.
It's not just the worst flooding the Peguis First Nation has seen. It's the fact that the Fisher River now spills its banks every few years, 5 times in the last 16 years.
Our planning as far as the critical infrastructure, we're backfilling roads, making sure accessibility.
Chief Glenn Hudson says they're sandbagging and getting people to safety. But the traditional response in this country to evacuate and rebuild does not recognize that climate change will bring more flooding to deal with.
We are very clearly seeing the increase in the inundation as well as the water depth all across the country.
Right now, the Peguis First Nation is confronting devastating floodwaters, but roads are also flooded in northwestern Ontario, with evacuations along James Bay. Rising waters are forcing people from their homes in Hay River, Northwest Territories. And in BC, heavy snowmelt could lead to floods in several regions, notably from North Thompson to the Upper Fraser and in the most northern parts of British Columbia. In BC this spring, there is a lot of snow yet to melt in the mountains, and the latest forecast suggests major floods could come in June.
The risk is that because of the delayed snow melts, all of the elevations of snow, the low, the mid, and high, all melt simultaneously, and we end up seeing rapid peaks and rises in the rivers.
Canada is a nation of rivers and lakes, and there will be more water where people live in the future. For Peguis First Nation, Western University modeling suggests current conditions along the Fisher River will look like this 100 years from now because of climate change.
More area is going to be kind of covered by the floods in the future. The cost of rebuilding at the same location is going to be very high.
In Manitoba, some communities are protected by a ring dike, but for the small, spread-out people of Peguis First Nation, there is only immediate relief. What it wants is infrastructure and a permanent solution.
That's their home, that's their livelihood, and a place they built of solace. So, they want to protect that.
Peguis is not alone. Over time, more and more Canadians will face flooding, and governments will have to do more than just keep rebuilding. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
In the U.S., a vote for a law to preserve access to abortion has failed in the Senate. And as the U.S. Supreme Court appears poised to overturn the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling, that leaves women and doctors in a precarious situation. Jackson Prosco explains.
The abortion fight traveled from the U.S. Supreme Court to the Senate, where Democrats pushed a vote on national protections for reproductive rights, knowing it was doomed to fail.
Stand with women to protect their freedoms, or stand with MAGA Republicans and take our country into a dark and repressive future.
A leaked draft decision from the Supreme Court suggests the abortion access offered by the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision is on the cusp of repeal. Republicans have hinted they could institute a national ban if they take power in Congress and the White House in 2024.
We stand strongly with the rule of law. We pray for the justices to have resolve, and we pray for the future of life in this country.
We are not your incubators!
The near certainty of Roe's rollback has fueled protests outside the homes of Supreme Court justices and warnings about the devastating impact on American society.
Access to reproductive health care, including abortion, helped lead to increased labor force participation. It enabled many women to finish school.
The biggest worries are in states like Tennessee, one of 13 states with so-called trigger laws that will automatically ban abortion once Roe is overturned.
The government is coming into the exam room and deciding women's reproductive health for themselves.
Physicians warn a post-Roe world will leave women in jeopardy and create an ethical quagmire for doctors who've taken an oath to first do no harm.
What happens when that comes up against the law?
So our law doesn't really explicitly state what, life of the mother means.
Women in America are unlikely to get any more certainty until the court makes its final ruling later this summer. What happens after that will be decided by lawmakers and could lead to a system with vastly different access to abortion in different parts of the United States. Donna?
All right, Jackson, thanks. The federal government here in Canada has been criticized for being slow to act after promising to protect a woman's right to choose. Today, Canada's health minister announced $3.5 million for two organizations to help expand access to abortion. But that's just a small portion of a $45 million promise in last year's budget. Advocates say there's lots of other ways to spend the money, including on universal access to all forms of contraception. Abigail Beeman looks at what that really means.
In my class and just in my friend groups, we have a lot of individuals who cannot necessarily use oral contraceptive methods. A really easy and common reason for this is that if you have migraines, they can actually make migraines worse.
Medical student Danielle Judd is lobbying federal and provincial politicians for free access to contraception of all kinds.
From what we have heard so far, we haven't had anyone promise to provide necessarily universal access to contraception.
At first glance, that sounds confusing since the New Democrats have been pushing for what they call exactly that. But it's a complicated topic. The Canadian Federation of Medical Students goes beyond the pill to call for coverage of all kinds of birth control, including copper IUDs. Right now, it's nearly impossible to get those covered by insurance. IUDs fall into a category known as longer-acting contraception.
If we switch people from methods like pills that can fail on average 9% per year to a method that fails only about 2 in 1,000 or 0.2% per year, you're actually significantly reducing the number of unplanned pregnancies. And with that, you significantly reduce the healthcare costs.
When we asked the New Democrat leader whether IUDs are part of his plan, he was non-committal.
So we want a broad as possible formulary, meaning the list of medication that's covered is as broad as possible.
Setting IUDs aside and looking at the big picture, there are all kinds of barriers to birth control, especially for people who are marginalized, low income, or uninsured.
When we look at the kind of contraception that is used in Canada, it appears bound to financial ability instead of really what works for people.
The Liberals say they're open to the idea, but won't get into specifics.
It's an important thing to note. It is something that we're looking at, and that's what I'll say for now.
Of course, healthcare is a provincial responsibility and coverage varies. Some people are eligible for some forms of birth control coverage in BC, Ontario, and Quebec as examples. The Canadian Federation of Medical Students wants the federal government to make it a universal mandate Canada-wide. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Acknowledging its shameful history, coming up, the first report on American residential schools for Indigenous children. For the first time, the United States is examining its history of Indigenous residential schools, what were known as Indian boarding schools. A new report found at least 500 Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children died while attending Indian boarding schools run or supported by the U.S. government. That number falls well short of some independent estimates of deaths and does not address how the children died or who was responsible. The long-awaited study by the U.S. Interior Department was prompted by the discovery of unmarked graves at former residential schools in Canada. American investigators found marked and unmarked graves at 53 boarding schools, a figure that's expected to grow, and it identified more than 400 schools across the U.S. where Indigenous children were taken. The report also sheds little new light on the physical and sexual abuse generations of Indigenous children endured at the schools, which were open for more than 150 years, starting in the early 1800s. A veteran journalist with Al Jazeera has been shot and killed while covering an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank, and there are calls for an independent investigation. Mourners confronted police outside the family home of correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh. She was shot in the head while with a group of journalists covering an Israeli army raid on a refugee camp. She was wearing a bulletproof vest with the words "press" spelled out on it. Al Jazeera accuses Israel, saying she was assassinated in cold blood by Israeli soldiers. Israel claims she may have been hit by Palestinian gunfire. She was an American citizen, and the White House press secretary today described her as a reporting legend and called for an immediate and thorough investigation and full accountability. Ahead, the clash of the Conservative candidates in their first official leadership debate. The 6 people in the running for the leadership of the federal Conservative Party are in Edmonton tonight for the first official debate organized by the party. Our David Aiken is there. David, the loudest voices tend to get the most attention. What are you expecting tonight?
Well, Donna, most of the sound and fury at last week's debate in Ottawa came from Ontario MP Pierre Poilievre, who aggressively attacked former Quebec Premier Jean Charest. But tonight, we expect Poilievre to turn his guns on the candidate who was not at last week's debate in Ottawa, and that would be Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown.
Looking forward to a conversation about the future of the party and the direction we need to go.
Brown is a former MP and former Ontario PC leader, and he will be getting his first serious challenge of this leadership race. Many partisan observers hope the challenge comes on policy.
I think a lot of people are calling for some civility in this debate. The Conservative coalition does need to get along.
I'm running for Prime Minister.
But insiders say Poilievre is not going to change his spots overnight, and he is expected to come at Brown with the same ferocity he came at Charest last week.
The average trucker has more integrity in his pinky finger than you had in your entire scandal-plagued Liberal cabinet.
As Jean Charest arrived for debate rehearsals, he said he'll be happy to have Brown join the group on stage.
It can only be better and good because in the sense that we need, everyone on the stage. Every voice should be heard.
Candidate and Ontario MPP Roman Baber arrived for rehearsal with a just-announced policy proposal. He would end equalization and turn the resulting savings, about $21 billion, back to Canadians in the form of tax cuts. Meanwhile, it cannot be coincidence that the governing Liberals made some announcements today about 2 hot-button issues that have tripped up Conservatives in the last 2 elections. The Liberals announced improved abortion access and tightened gun control. We'll see what Conservative leadership candidates do with that when they kick things off later tonight. Donna.
All right, David Aiken in Edmonton tonight. Thanks. Rap turned rallying cry next. Ukrainian resolve at the world's biggest pop music contest. The Eurovision Song Contest always has some surprises. This year, of course, it's happening against a backdrop of war on the edge of Europe. And one of the front runners is from Ukraine. Kalush Orchestra mixes rap with Ukrainian folk music, and they've been voted through to the grand final. Their song has become an anthem for all the pain their country is going through. Heather Urix West reports.
The song is called Stefania, written by the lead singer of Kalush Orchestra before the Russian invasion of Ukraine about his mother. But now, being heard on the world stage thanks to the Eurovision Song Contest, it has taken on new meaning.
The mixture of rap and Ukrainian folk, and also, I think the synonym Stefania in the motherland, it's become a synonym for, Ukraine as a country, fighting for their motherland.
Oh, I watched yesterday and it's like, I cried.
For Slava Slez, a Ukrainian living in Calgary, watching her country advance to the Eurovision final has been a moment of much needed joy.
I'm proud of my country and I'm proud of I'm from Ukraine. For Ukrainians, it's very important to feel something good news.
There is no escape from the war. Even on a platform usually full of the fantastical and ridiculous, Russia's invasion is a constant presence. The men of Kalush Orchestra needed special permission to leave Ukraine to compete at Eurovision. Other men over 18 are required to stay and fight. And the Ukrainian broadcasts of every performance come from a bomb shelter. We are here to show that Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian music exist. They are alive, the band says. They'll compete in the final on Saturday night.
We really hope we will win. We think about this will happen. And next year we will celebrate the Eurovision in Ukraine.
Heather Urix West, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is University Bridge in Saskatoon over the South Saskatchewan River. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.